I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and I have carried the weight of my family's whispers for as long as I can remember. Every reunion, every wedding, every casual dinner that should have felt like warmth instead pressed on me like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. My aunt's voice was the loudest, her words cutting deeper than any blade. "This girl doesn't even look like part of our family." She didn't say it once. She repeated it over the years, each time with new venom, as though reminding everyone that I was somehow an outsider seated at their table. That particular night, I remember lowering my gaze and drinking water, hiding the tremor in my hands, disguising the storm inside me. I said nothing, because silence was the only shield I had learned to carry. But inside, something cracked wide open. My family thought I was fragile, submissive, powerless, a woman destined to swallow insults until I choked on them. Yet beneath my quiet exterior, I was cataloging every slight, every betrayal, every cruel laugh. I had long stopped asking for love. Now I only waited for evidence, for proof of what my gut had screamed for years. That night I returned home, the echoes of ridicule still ringing in my ears, and I opened a locked drawer no one in my family knew existed. Inside was a file, papers, notes, fragments I had collected in secret, evidence of affairs, financial fraud, whispered scandals that had been buried under expensive rugs and polished reputations. Among them was the one document I had guarded more fiercely than anything, the DNA report. It had arrived weeks earlier, confirming what I had suspected my entire life. The woman who mocked me was not my aunt by blood. She was something else, something darker, connected to me through lies rather than bloodlines. As I held the report in my trembling hands that night, the pages whispered back to me, I didn't belong, but not in the way they thought. I wasn't less. I wasn't weak. I was different, and I finally had proof strong enough to shatter their carefully constructed empire of deceit. The next morning, I woke with a clarity that felt almost dangerous, as if the sunlight itself was conspiring with me. I moved through my apartment like a stranger in my own skin, every gesture deliberate, every thought sharper than the last. The DNA report sat folded neatly inside a plain envelope on my desk, and beside it lay the leather-bound journal where I had documented the fragments of truth I had unearthed over the years. My aunt had always claimed to be the moral compass of our family, the one who enforced boundaries, who reminded everyone of traditions, who measured worth in appearances. But I knew better. Her pristine image was a mask, and I had seen the cracks beneath it. I had letters, unsigned but unmistakable, tracing her back to a scandal that could ruin her reputation forever. I had receipts, photocopies, bank transfers she swore didn't exist. And now I had proof she had lied about me, about my place in this family. The irony was bitter. The woman who mocked me for being different was the one built on deception. That evening, I went about my day as though nothing had shifted, as though my world hadn't just tilted into an entirely new orbit. I cooked, I cleaned, I answered emails. But the envelope never left my sight, and with every passing hour, the decision hardened inside me like stone. I would not confront her with anger, not with shouts, not with the trembling voice of a victim. I would place the truth exactly where it belonged, on her bed, in her home, in the silence of her midnight hours, so that when her eyes scanned the words, she would feel the same chill that had haunted me for decades. It wasn't about revenge alone. It was about rewriting the narrative they had forced on me. For 35 years, they had shaped me as the misfit, the shadow at the edge of family portraits. Now I would return the favor, not with rage, but with undeniable evidence. The DNA report would speak louder than any defense I could muster. That night, with my heart pounding like war drums, I drove to her house. The neighborhood was quiet, blanketed in the hush of suburban wealth, but my pulse refused to slow. I slipped inside with a spare key she didn't know I still had, and with footsteps softer than a confession, I placed the envelope on her bed. One small act, but it was enough to set an avalanche in motion. I left her house without looking back, though every instinct in me wanted to linger, to wait for the scream that would inevitably follow when her eyes met the report. Instead, I drove into the night, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. The city lights blurred past me, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I thought about the years I had endured. Every birthday overshadowed by sarcasm, every accomplishment dismissed as luck, every family gathering where laughter erupted at my expense. I thought of the night she accused me of stealing when her own daughter had pawned heirloom jewelry. I thought of the day she whispered to my mother, loud enough for me to hear, that I was cursed, that I was proof of shame carried forward. They believed they had buried me under silence, but what they never understood was that silence can be a womb as much as it is a grave. In silence, I had grown teeth. In silence, I had watched them expose their weaknesses, their vanity, their greed. By the time I reached home, the weight of the decision had lifted, replaced by something else entirely, a grim satisfaction that hummed through my veins. I checked my phone repeatedly that night, waiting for the storm to break, for someone in the family to call me with panic in their voice. Hours ticked by, and still nothing came. Sleep evaded me, but I didn't mind. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, waiting like a hunter who knows the prey will eventually wander into the snare. When dawn finally bled into the sky, my phone buzzed at last. It was my cousin, her voice trembling, trying to mask hysteria with politeness. "Charmaine," she said, "something happened last night. Aunt is not well. She found something." I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. The envelope had already spoken. I murmured vague condolences, keeping my tone flat, almost detached, but inside my chest, my heart beat with dangerous rhythm. The trap had been sprung, but this was only the beginning. I knew my aunt too well. She wouldn't crumble quietly. She would thrash, she would claw, she would try to drag me down with her. And that was exactly what I wanted. For the first time in decades, I wasn't playing defense. I was moving the pieces across the board, and she had no idea how many steps ahead I already was. By mid-morning, the family group chat exploded. Notifications chimed one after another, a rapid-fire chorus of confusion and accusation. "What is this about?" one uncle wrote. "Charmaine, did you know?" Another message flashed. My cousin posted a string of crying emojis, followed by a vague line. "This can't be true, can it?" No one dared to spell it out, but I knew they all had seen the report by now. My aunt, however, stayed eerily silent, her absence louder than all their messages combined. I imagined her pacing in her immaculate bedroom, gripping the papers with trembling hands, trying to find a way to explain away something she could never undo. At noon, the phone rang, her number on the screen, her name glowing like a warning flare. I let it ring out. Twice. 3 times. Finally, I picked up, my voice steady. "Charmaine," she hissed, her tone jagged, stripped of its usual superiority. "We need to talk. Alone." I almost laughed at the word alone. For years she had humiliated me in front of others, used the crowd as her weapon, but now she wanted privacy? I told her calmly, "There's nothing to discuss. The truth is written in black and white. Maybe you should explain it to the rest of the family." Her silence on the other end was thick, like static before a storm. Then, with a sharp edge, she spat, "You'll regret this." I hung up without replying, my hand trembling not with fear, but with exhilaration. The war she had started years ago was finally mine to finish. By evening, alliances began forming. Some cousins reached out privately, their curiosity masked as concern. "We never knew," one messaged. "Is it really true?" another asked. I answered with careful restraint. "Ask her." I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The burden of explanation was hers. Yet I knew this family well enough to anticipate what would come next. They wouldn't rally behind me out of loyalty. They would circle her, desperate to preserve appearances, to silence me, to restore the illusion of harmony. But illusions are fragile things, and I had more than one truth hidden in my drawer. The DNA report was merely the first domino I had pushed. The rest, the bank transfers, the letters, the documents, waited like shadows behind me, ready to descend when the moment demanded. I looked at the calendar that night, a quiet smile spreading across my face. For the first time in my life, the dates ahead didn't feel like an endless repetition of gatherings where I would sit silently at the edge. They felt like countdowns. The countdown began in ways both subtle and sudden. Within days, whispers spread through the extended family, half-truths, rumors, exaggerated versions of the DNA report that had taken on a life of its own. My uncle, who once prided himself on never interfering in women's squabbles, suddenly called me, his voice low, his tone clipped. "Charmaine, you've done enough damage. Do you have any idea what this could do to us?" Us. That word tasted sour on my tongue. For years, us had never included me. I had been tolerated, endured, mocked, but never truly part of their circle. And now that their reputation trembled, suddenly I was counted in the collective. I let his words wash over me before answering softly, "I didn't do anything. The truth did." His silence lingered a second too long, then the line went dead. That evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the air heavy with tension, I realized how deeply fear corrodes people. It wasn't me they were afraid of, it was exposure. Each one of them carried secrets, and my aunt wasn't the only guilty party. That was why they squirmed, why they sent frantic calls, why they begged me to meet and discuss this privately. They didn't want resolution. They wanted silence. But silence was no longer mine to give. By the third day, my mother finally broke her own quiet stance. She came to me in person, her face pale, her eyes darting like a woman who'd aged 10 years overnight. "Why, Charmaine," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Couldn't you just let it go? Families survive on forgiveness." I stared at her, unable to believe the audacity. Forgiveness? For decades of humiliation? For nights when I lay awake crying into a pillow, praying to vanish? I wanted to shout, but instead my voice came out low, controlled. "Families also survive on truth, Mother. Or, do you prefer lies?" Tears welled to her eyes, and for a fleeting second I almost softened. But then I remembered the nights she had stood by silently as my aunt shredded me with her words, never once stepping in, never once shielding me. Her tears now were not for me. They were for the ruins spreading through the family tree. That night, unable to sleep, I walked to my desk and unlocked the drawer again. My hand hovered over the stack of papers, bank transfers, letters, photocopied documents. The DNA report had been my opening move, but I realized the game was far from over. If they thought they could shame me into retreat, they had gravely underestimated me. This wasn't merely revenge. This was reclamation. And I would not stop until every mask they wore was torn away. The storm finally broke at the next family gathering, one I had not been invited to but attended anyway. It was my cousin's engagement party, hosted in a glittering banquet hall draped with flowers, music, and all the hollow laughter of a clan desperate to prove everything was normal. I arrived alone, dressed in a simple black dress that contrasted sharply with the sequined gowns around me. Heads turned as I walked in, whispers snaked through the room, and I felt the collective gaze settle heavy on my shoulders. My aunt sat near the center, her posture stiff, her face painted in layers of makeup that failed to conceal the exhaustion beneath. When her eyes met mine, something flickered there. Fear, anger, desperation, all tangled together like a net. I approached the table slowly, each step deliberate, and placed a slim manila folder right in front of her. Conversation stilled. Glasses clinked nervously. My voice was steady as I said, "Since we're all gathered, maybe it's time everyone sees what truth really looks like." Gasps rippled through the crowd as she fumbled with the folder, her trembling fingers spilling out the contents, receipts, bank transfers, letters linking her to offshore accounts, money siphoned in the shadows while she preached morality in daylight. My uncle stood abruptly, his face ashen, while my cousins muttered, shocked, disbelieving. My aunt tried to speak, to deny, but the evidence lay scattered across the white linen like shattered glass. For the first time in my life, I watched her scramble, her carefully constructed authority crumbling beneath her hands. "These are lies," she spat, but the words lacked weight. Someone from the crowd whispered, "But it has her signature. Another voice added, and those dates match perfectly. The room was a pressure cooker, years of silent suspicion now given form. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than I ever could. You told me I didn't belong, I said softly, but maybe it's you, who was never truly part of this family. A hush fell so deep it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. For once, I was not the outsider. She was. And the knowledge was sweeter than I ever imagined. As I turned to leave, I felt no triumph, only a quiet, steady strength. I wasn't finished yet, but I had cracked the foundation. And when foundations crack, the house always falls. The fallout from that night was immediate, a wildfire spreading faster than anyone could contain. By dawn, the family group chat was in ruins, accusations, denials, half-hearted defenses, and silent withdrawals flooding the thread until it became unreadable. My aunt stopped answering calls altogether, retreating into her house like a wounded animal cornered in its den. But her silence didn't shield her. If anything, it made her look guiltier. My cousins whispered that neighbors had started asking questions, that donations she had claimed to give the church never truly reached there, that her name was already circling among business partners who once trusted her implicitly. For me, the strangest thing was the sudden shift in how others regarded me. Relatives who had once dismissed me as the quiet one now sent messages filled with cautious respect, as though testing whether I might use what else I knew against them. They didn't realize how much I had already seen, how many threads I could pull if I chose. Every interaction became a calculation. Who feared me, who despised me, who might secretly want me to burn the entire legacy down. I began to notice small things. A cousin deleting old photos from social media, an uncle suddenly cashing bonds, my mother visiting me with trembling hands holding tea, trying to pretend she still held authority. But what startled me most was the shift within myself. For years I had walked like a shadow, trying to take up as little space as possible, terrified of confrontation. Now I felt something fierce awaken, a clarity so sharp it nearly scared me. I no longer wanted their acceptance, their crumbs of pity. I wanted accountability. Still, part of me wondered, had I gone too far? The question lingered one restless night when I stood before my mirror, staring into my own eyes. But then I remembered her words, the cruel laughter, the dismissal of my very bloodline, and the doubt dissolved. Some truths are too heavy to bury, and some battles too important to walk away from. What began as survival was transforming into something larger, a reckoning. And whether they liked it or not, I was no longer the silent bystander in their story. I was the author, holding the pen they never thought I'd dare to pick up. Days stretched into weeks, and the ripples of what I had unleashed grew into waves that battered every corner of the family. Invitations that once flowed freely to weddings, parties, charity galas suddenly stopped arriving at my aunt's doorstep. Her so-called friends whispered behind manicured hands, distancing themselves to avoid the taint of scandal. I heard through a cousin that her business partners were demanding answers about missing funds, and that one particularly ruthless associate had threatened legal action. For a woman who built her identity on control, watching her unravel was both terrifying and oddly satisfying. Yet, what surprised me was how quickly the narrative shifted. In hushed conversations, some began to call me brave, others called me cruel, and still more called me dangerous. I realized then that the line between justice and vengeance was thin, almost invisible, and I was walking it with deliberate precision. At night, I spread the rest of my documents across the desk, pages marked in my handwriting, highlighted receipts, photocopied bank statements. It wasn't just my aunt. So many of them had skeletons tucked neatly into closets, assuming no one would ever dare rattle the door. I saw names tied to offshore accounts, funds siphoned through charities, even quiet evidence of affairs hushed up with money. Every page was a loaded weapon, and I was the one holding the arsenal. But holding power is its own kind of prison. I found myself awake at odd hours, staring at the papers, questioning what it would cost me if I went further. Would I destroy them all? Would I become the very thing I despised, cold, merciless, intoxicated by the taste of retribution? Or was this what survival looked like when you've been cornered too long? My reflection in the darkened window offered no answers, only the outline of a woman I barely recognized, no longer fragile, no longer silent, but sharpened into something formidable. The choice wasn't whether to fight, it was how much of the battlefield I was willing to scorch. And deep down, I knew the war had only just begun. I began to notice the small, insistent ways my life shifted after I pulled the first thread. People who had smiled at me politely now watched with curdled curiosity. Some avoided my gaze as if guilt would smudge their faces. Letters arrived from unfamiliar law firms asking pointed questions about transactions my aunt had authorized, their envelopes crisply bearing professional seals I had never seen before. Distant cousins sent messages framed as concern but threaded with accusation, probing for details while pretending to care. My mother paced the apartment more often, fingers whirring the teacup in a rhythm that matched the thud of my heart, her voice a low tremor when she asked if I had thought about the consequences. Each time she tried to plead for calm, I could see in her eyes the measure of her fear, not for me, but for the reputation that had for decades defined their place. I answered her with thin patience, explaining causes and timing, but she needed absolution more than truth, and absolution was a thing I had never had to offer. Work became a precarious island where colleagues whispered behind hands and tried to appear impartial while their curiosity burned like a fever. Strangers at the market glanced at my face, and then at the neat stack of documents I held under my arm, as if deciding whether a woman like me could instigate such an upheaval. My phone, once a lifeline of quiet greetings and mundane check-ins, now hummed with angry voicemails from relatives, polite threats veiled as warnings, and at least one anonymous message promising ruin unless I stopped. The messages tried to paint me as unstable, as a vindictive interloper who enjoyed the chaos she'd caused, but the evidence I held did not care for gossip. It waited in powdered silence, patient and immutable. Some nights I dreamed of courtrooms, of lit rooms where the truth was a heavy stone tossed into indifferent water, every ripple a family member flinching under light. In those dreams I saw faces I had once idolized crack and flinch, my aunt's practiced composure skittering like glass, my uncle's humor deserted by a shadow of panic. There was a terrible intimacy to watching people unravel, and yet I felt no malice that could be easily named, only a steady, unadorned need for justice that had hardened into resolve. At times I surprised myself with the calmness of my own decisions. Who to tell, when to hold back, which documents to release and which to withhold to maintain leverage and prevent the chaos from spiraling into something ugly. I kept records meticulously, cataloged receipts and timestamps, copies of emails and bank statements, the kind of labor that required patience and a mind that would not rush toward melodrama. Each record was a quiet accusation, and together they formed a lattice capable of supporting a case, a reckoning, a rewriting of stories long told and believed. Neighbors began to ask questions, subtle at first, then less so, and small talk at the grocery store took on a new edge, sympathetic eyebrows and the furtive clearing of throats. The local gossip columnist, opportunistic as any predator, smelled a narrative and began to probe, which sent my aunt into a loop of frantic calls, trying to stem the tide with frantic denials and appeals to loyalty. I could have backed away when the first article appeared, or when the first creditor called, but backing away felt like surrendering to a pattern I had refused my whole life, being silenced so others could feel safe. Instead, I tightened my grip and prepared for the inevitable legal dance that comes after secrets meet sunlight, affidavits, questions, the cold translation of human treachery into forms and checkboxes. At night, when the apartment receded into shadow, I would sit with a single lamp burning low and read the documents again, not for the facts they contained, but for the proof that I had been observant, patient, and ultimately right. My hands, once used to gentle tasks and careful domestic rhythms, now moved with the steadiness of someone who had practiced endurance as a craft. People tried to flatter me into silence, doorstep apologies, awkward offers of dinner, requests to speak privately and resolve things like family, But those offers were camouflage for pressure, and I refused their thin olive branches. Instead, lawyers began to call me directly to ask if I would testify if things progressed. Their voices were clinical yet curious, measuring the woman behind the paper trail. The realization that I had become a subject of legal interest was disorienting and oddly empowering. My truth had weight that could bend institutional attention toward it. I thought of the children in the family, nieces and nephews who had never known the whispered cruelty but would inherit its consequences if nothing shifted, and my resolve hardened further. I was not simply dismantling a persona. I was preventing a cycle that might otherwise repeat itself in small, unseen violences for another generation. Still, each decision to reveal another page came with cost: friendless lunches, the steady thinning of invitations, and nights where the silence felt heavier than any scorn. Sometimes loneliness pressed its face against mine like a cold window pane. Other times, an unexpected ally offered a small mercy. A neighbor with a casserole, a former teacher who said she had suspected things and admired my courage. These small kindnesses were like salt on an open wound. They stung, but they reminded me that truth sometimes yields solace in unlikely forms. Financial pressures crept in as businesses linked to my aunt delayed payments and closed doors. Even as her network unraveled, the legal machinery moved with the glacial speed of consequence. The world felt both narrowed and widened, narrowed by the tremor of personal cost, widened by the possibility of a different life after the dust settled. And always there was the fear, sharp and private, that what I had done could be twisted into a tale where I became the villain in others' eyes, a woman who weaponized truth for satisfaction rather than justice. I vowed to hold the light until their lies were exposed, even if it meant standing alone in the ruins of what once was that I must. The first court summons arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under my door in a thick white envelope that felt heavier than its paper could justify. My name in bold print, my aunt's name listed opposite, and beneath it the cold machinery of the state laid bare in black ink. She had filed a claim of defamation, accusing me of spreading lies designed to ruin her. I laughed when I first read it, a sharp sound that startled even me. Lies? The irony was suffocating. Every word, every document, every receipt I had shared was factual, verified, undeniable. But her tactic was clear: drown me in procedure, force me into silence by entangling me in the exhausting grind of courtrooms and legal fees. It was a classic maneuver of the guilty, and for a moment it worked. Fear slipped icy fingers into my chest as I imagined losing not just the case, but the fragile life I had begun to piece together outside of their shadows. Yet as quickly as the fear came, resolve followed. I gathered my files, my journals, my meticulous timelines, and I walked them to the lawyer's office I had contacted weeks ago in quiet preparation. He listened carefully, his eyes flicking over the mountain of evidence I spread across his polished desk. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable but firm. "If you're telling me the truth, Charmaine," he said, "then she's not just guilty of lying. She's committed crimes that go beyond family shame. This could open doors she's desperate to keep locked." His words steadied me more than he knew. I left his office with a copy of my statement, my steps lighter than they had been in years. Outside, the city roared on with indifference, traffic rushing, people hurrying, lives unfolding that had nothing to do with my private war. And yet, in that moment, I felt strangely aligned with the chaos, as if my own storm was just another truth breaking into daylight. Over the following weeks, the case consumed me. Depositions, questions, my character dissected and examined like a specimen on a slide. My aunt's lawyers painted me as unstable, vindictive, desperate for attention. They called me bitter, unloved, envious of a family that had only ever tried to help me. I sat quietly as they spoke, the words brushing against my skin like old bruises. But then it was my turn. With the composure I had honed from years of swallowing pain, I laid out the facts one by one, document by document, never raising my voice, never wavering. The judge listened, the court stenographer typed, and for the first time in my life, the truth did not feel like a burden but like armor. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer, each page a nail sealing shut the coffin of her carefully crafted image. By the time the first hearing ended, I saw it in her eyes, the flicker of panic, the realization that her empire of lies was collapsing, and that it was collapsing at the hands of the woman she had spent decades belittling. The courtroom became a theater of unraveling truths, each session pulling back layers my aunt had spent her life perfecting. Witnesses emerged, some willingly, others dragged by subpoena, each carrying fragments of her deception. A former employee testified about funds siphoned through shell accounts. A charity organizer revealed donations that mysteriously vanished. Even one of her closest friends admitted to receiving hush money for years. Every revelation landed like a thunderclap, and with each one, my aunt's once commanding posture shrank a little more. She tried to mask her fear with defiance, but I could see the cracks splintering through her carefully arranged facade. Meanwhile, I felt a transformation surging within me that I had not anticipated. At first, my fight had been about survival, about proving I was not the outcast she had painted me to be. But standing there, watching justice stitch itself together piece by piece, I realized this was larger than just my story. It was about the rot of corruption hidden under the mask of family honor, about every silenced voice that never had the evidence or courage to speak. I became their echo, the embodiment of every overlooked daughter, every dismissed truth. At night, though, the cost weighed on me heavily. Sleep became elusive, my dreams littered with images of her face twisted in rage, of my own hands clutching files that felt heavier with every passing day. Some mornings, I woke wondering if I was becoming addicted to the fight, if victory had become less about justice and more about power. But then I would remember her words, the casual cruelty of telling a room full of people that I didn't even belong to my own bloodline, and the doubt hardened into resolve again. By the third hearing, her lawyers looked weary, their questions more frantic than precise. My lawyer leaned close at one point and whispered, "She knows she's cornered." I believed him, but I also knew the most dangerous animal is not the one who's strong, but the one who has nothing left to lose. And as the gavel fell signaling yet another adjournment, I caught her gaze across the room. There was no smugness left, no disdain, only raw hatred. It should have frightened me, but instead it fueled me. For the first time, I no longer felt like her victim. I felt like her reckoning. The verdict came on a rain-soaked afternoon, the kind of day where the sky itself seemed to mirror the tension inside the courthouse. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that the knuckles blanched white, my heart drumming so loudly I wondered if the judge could hear it. My aunt sat opposite, her once pristine suit rumpled, her eyes hollow, her lips pressed thin as if she were chewing on every mistake she had ever made. The judge's voice filled the chamber, calm but merciless, her case against me dismissed, my evidence forwarded to prosecutors for investigation, assets frozen pending inquiry. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, a sharp sob from somewhere behind me. I felt the weight of years lifting, but it wasn't joy that overtook me. It was something heavier, sharper, a sense that justice, once awakened, demanded more than relief. As reporters swarmed outside, microphones thrust toward me, I spoke carefully, choosing words that would not just end her reign but redefine me. This was never about revenge, I said, my voice steady despite the storm around us. It was about truth, about showing that silence only feeds corruption, and that even the smallest voice can shatter the loudest lie. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and for once, I didn't shrink. I stood taller than I ever had, no longer the girl who lowered her gaze at family dinners, no longer the woman sipping water to hide her humiliation. I was something else now, scarred, yes, but sharpened into steel. In the weeks that followed, her world crumbled. Business partners fled, creditors circled, and her reputation, once untouchable, became ash in the wind. People whispered my name differently now, not as a footnote, not as pity, but as proof of resilience, justice, and survival. Yet even as I tasted this strange victory, I knew the story wasn't just about me. It was a mirror for anyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or betrayed by those they trusted most. And so, as I closed the final chapter of this battle, I knew another was waiting to be written, not of pain, but of strength, of what rises after the ashes settle. If you've walked through fire, if you've carried scars others tried to make your shame, then my story is also yours. Watch how I turned humiliation into power, betrayal into reckoning, and silence into a weapon. This is not just an ending, it's a beginning. So if you've followed me this far, don't stop now. Like, subscribe, and step into the storm with me, because the fight for truth is never truly over.